On a quiet night, long after the laboratories of Paris have gone dark, imagine a single woman walking home under a silver, misty sky. Her coat is thin against the cold. Her hands are rough from chemicals and glass. In the pocket of that worn coat, in small vials, she carries something no one has ever truly seen before: invisible fire, a new kind of energy leaking out of the very heart of matter. Her notebooks glow faintly on the nightstand beside her bed. The walls of her lab remember her footsteps. Her name is Marie Curie. She will win 2 Nobel Prizes. She will change physics and medicine forever. And slowly, quietly, the same forces she is studying will begin to unmake her from the inside out. She does not know that yet. She only knows the feeling of curiosity that will not let her sleep, the pull of work that stretches late into the night, the joy that rises in her chest when numbers on a page finally make sense. She is burning herself like a candle to push back the darkness of the unknown. The light she makes will heal millions, but it will never stop asking a price. If these words carry you closer to sleep, let this channel stay by your side too, like a soft lamp at the edge of your room. When the day has been loud and your thoughts feel tangled, you can come back here and let these stories move gently around you. You do not have to remember every detail. You do not have to solve every mystery. Tonight, you only need to listen as we walk beside a woman who followed the tiniest traces of energy until they led her all the way to the borders of her own body. The city of her childhood wore another country's colors. In the streets of Warsaw, the flags were Russian, the uniforms were Russian, the orders came from far away. But under those flags, behind those uniforms, a quiet, stubborn Poland still breathed. It breathed in the language spoken at kitchen tables. It breathed in the songs whispered at night. It breathed in the minds of children who were told to be small and careful, but who sometimes, secretly, dreamed of something more. Maria Sklodowska was one of those children. She was not yet Marie Curie, not yet the woman of laboratories and glowing vials. She was just a girl in a crowded apartment and a city under watch, listening very closely to a world that told her to keep her head down. Her home was filled with the smell of chalk and paper and worn wool. Her father, Vladislav, had once been a respected teacher, a man whose love for science and Polish culture had lit up his classroom. But loving Poland too openly, teaching too freely, meant trouble under Russian rule. He lost good positions, one after another, until the family slid from comfort into a thin, worrying kind of poverty. Still, he brought his love of learning home. There were physics instruments with missing pieces, maps of a Poland that no longer officially existed, boxes of old textbooks stacked in corners. To most visitors, they were just clutter. To Maria, they were treasure. Her mother, Bronislava, was gentler and more distant at the same time. She ran a girls' school, strict and proper, and at home she carried herself with the same quiet discipline. There was a reason for the distance: illness. Tuberculosis, the quiet thief of breath, had touched her. In those days, people did not know how it spread, only that it clung to families and did not easily let go. She avoided hugging her children not because she did not love them, but because she was afraid of giving them her sickness. To a little girl, that kind of love could feel like cold air. You know it is there, but you cannot wrap yourself in it. Maria watched all of this with wide, serious eyes. She saw her father come home with worry lines carved deeper into his face. She saw her mother's coughing fits behind closed doors. She saw the careful ways her family tried to hide how much they were struggling. Children often understand more than adults think they do. She understood that money was a problem. She understood that Poland was not free. She understood that to be too bold, too honest, could be dangerous. At school, the Russian authorities demanded loyalty lessons. Portraits of the Tsar looked down from the walls. History was bent and trimmed to praise the empire. Speaking Polish in certain contexts was discouraged, sometimes punished. But in secret classes, in the corners of ordinary lessons, teachers slipped in pieces of forbidden truth. They taught Polish history late in the day, when inspectors were less likely to walk in. They passed around banned books like contraband. Maria's father had done the same before he lost his posts. That quiet resistance was part of the air she breathed. She was a quick learner, faster than most, with a memory that caught and held facts like a net catching light. Numbers made sense to her in a way that felt almost soothing. Equations were not political. They didn't care who ruled Warsaw. They simply were. In a time when so much around her seemed unfair and unstable, the rules of mathematics felt like solid ground. Her teachers noticed. "She is gifted," they would say. "She could go far, if only—" And then they would stop, because the path ahead for a girl, even a brilliant one, was narrow. At home, loss came slowly, then all at once. First, a beloved sister, Zosia, died of typhus, a sudden, cruel illness that swept in and stole her away. Maria was still a child. The shock of it carved a deep, wordless hollow in her. She watched her parents stagger under their grief, each in their different way. Her mother folded further into herself. Her father, though he tried to stay strong, sometimes sat with his head in his hands, as if trying to press the pain back into his skull where no one could see it. A few years later, her mother died too, the tuberculosis finally taking what little strength she had left. Maria was 10. To lose one parent is a blow. To lose the second, even when you have older siblings and a remaining father, is another kind of fall. She became not just the clever child, but also the quiet one, the one who held her sorrow tight and turned it into a kind of inner hardness. Some of her early faith crumbled. She pulled back from the God she had prayed to as a little girl. But she did not pull back from learning. If anything, she clung to it more fiercely. It was something death could not take from her. Her family, for all their grief, believed deeply in education. The Skłodowskis had no treasure to leave their children except the one inside their heads. They encouraged reading, discussion, study. At the table, they talked about literature and science, about Polish poets and French mathematicians, about the way the world should be and the way it was. For a girl in that time, this was not ordinary. Many families thought too much learning spoiled a daughter's chances of marriage. But in Maria's home, knowledge was almost a sacred thing. School, for her, was both a refuge and a cage. She excelled, finishing her secondary education with a gold medal, top of her class. The medal felt heavy in her hand, a bright circle of proof that she was capable. But when she looked ahead, the path that had opened easily for talented boys narrowed to a thin thread for someone like her. The University of Warsaw did not admit women. Higher studies in Poland, under Russian rule, were blocked in almost every direction. So she did what so many bright, blocked people do. She went underground. In Warsaw, there were secret classes, sometimes called the floating university. They did not float on water, but from place to place, held in private apartments, in back rooms, in quiet corners where curious minds could meet. Young people hungry for learning, both men and women, came together to study subjects that the official schools either twisted or denied. There, Maria heard lectures on advanced mathematics, on physics, on literature and history that were not scrubbed clean by censors. She sat on chairs borrowed from family kitchens, on floors, on crates, her notebook balanced on her knees, and felt her mind stretch toward the wider world. At the same time, the weight of her family's situation pressed on her shoulders. Her father's income was not enough to support all the children. There was no scholarship waiting for her, no easy way to leave for Paris or any other city where women could study freely. She loved her studies, but love did not fill plates or pay rent. A decision hung over her, a choice that did not feel like a choice at all. She would have to work. The plan she and her older sister, Bronislawa, eventually made together was simple, hard, and full of hope. Bronislawa wanted to become a doctor, another path almost impossible for a woman in Poland. Paris, however, was more open. So they struck a bargain. Maria would work as a governess for several years, sending money to help Branya study medicine in France. When Branya finished and could support herself, she would help Maria come to Paris in term, so she too could attend university. It was like laying planks across a river one at a time, hoping they would hold long enough for both sisters to cross. Leaving Warsaw for the countryside was a quieter kind of exile. She went to live with wealthy families, caring for their children, teaching them basic lessons. From the outside, it was respectable, even enviable work for a young woman. She had room and board, a small salary. But inside, she often felt as if she had been pushed to the edge of her own life. While she drilled letters and numbers into the heads of her small pupils by day, she dreamed of differential equations, laboratories, the buzz of bright minds in crowded lecture halls. At night, when the household finally slept, she would pull out her own books and study by weak lamplight until her eyes burned. The years as a governess were not easy. Loneliness wrapped around her like a heavy cloak. In one household, she fell in love with the older son of the family, and for a brief moment it seemed that perhaps love could remake the rules. But his parents would not accept a match with a mere governess, no matter how intelligent she was. The relationship ended, leaving her with a heart that ached and a sharper sense of how class, as well as gender and politics, could trap a person in place. She did not give up. When despair threatened to flood her, she turned again to study. She set herself problems, worked through them alone, teaching herself higher-level mathematics and physics without a formal teacher. In the quiet of those provincial evenings, while outside the seasons turned and the fields changed color, she built an invisible foundation inside her mind. No one looking at her from the outside, just a young woman in plain clothes managing children and household expectations, could see that she was quietly shaping herself into a scientist. Every letter from Paris was a thin thread of hope. Branya wrote of lectures, of hospitals, of a city where ideas hummed in every cafe. She wrote of women in classrooms, not just in kitchens, of professors who took their minds seriously. The promise they had made to each other glowed at the back of Maria's thoughts. If she endured these years, if she saved every possible coin, one day she would walk those same streets. At last, after long seasons of work and saving, the plan began to take solid shape. Bronia completed her studies, became a doctor, married another Polish exile, and invited Maria to join them in Paris, offering her a room and support. It was not luxury, it was not ease, but it was a doorway. For Maria, now in her mid-20s, it was also a lifeline. Many girls in her position would already have been married, their lives folded into family duties. She had chosen another path, and now, finally, the world on the other side of that choice was within reach. Saying goodbye to Warsaw was complicated. This was the city of her childhood, of her family's laughter and sorrow, of her mother's illness and her father's stubborn lessons, of illegal classes and gold medals and grief. It was also a place where the walls of possibility had closed in on her at every turn. Standing on the platform, her luggage modest, her clothing simple, she must have felt both a sharp sadness and a fierce thrill. She was leaving the streets where she knew every corner, stepping into a future drawn mostly in imagination. The journey to Paris took her away from the flat landscapes of Poland, across borders that had once been lines on maps in her school books, through towns where she knew no one and nothing, toward a city whose name had lived for years in her mind like a promise. She spoke some French already, learned from books and practice, but now she would need it for everything, for buying food, for attending lectures, for asking directions when she was lost. On the threshold of this journey, she was still just one small figure among millions, a young woman with no money, no famous family, no guarantee that her dreams would come true. Yet inside her, something steady and bright had survived every loss and every disappointment, the belief that truth could be found by patient effort and that she had a right to seek it. As the train carried her westward, the fields sliding by in long, blurred strokes of color, she was moving not just across land, but into a different life. Ahead of her waited a cramped student room where she would sometimes have to choose between buying food and buying coal, lecture halls where she would be one of the only women, and a shabby laboratory where a strange new word, radioactivity, was waiting to be born. But that is all still in the dark, like a photograph that has not yet been developed. For now, we leave her on that journey, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes turned toward a window that reflects both her tired face and the passing world. The girl from Warsaw, who once hid in corners to listen to forbidden lessons, is on her way to become the woman who will pull invisible rays out of stone and into human understanding, even as those rays begin, drop by drop, to draw a quiet price from her own body. Paris greeted her not with grand palaces and glittering lights, but with cold air and noise. When Maria Sklodowska stepped off the train and onto the platform, she was carrying almost everything she owned in a few worn bags. The city she had dreamed about for so many years was right there, with its stone stations and busy streets, but there was no warm hand waiting to guide her, just signs in French, people rushing past, the smell of coal smoke and wet pavement. She pulled her coat closer and stepped forward anyway. Her sister Bronya and brother-in-law welcomed her into their small apartment with the joy of people who had shared a long, hard plan and finally seen it reach this point. There was not much space. Rooms were tight and every corner was already doing double duty. But for Maria, now calling herself Marie, it felt like arrival. Here, at last, she could inhale without that familiar sense of hitting a wall. Paris had its own rules, its own prejudices, but one thing was clear: the doors of the university were open to women. Not wide, not easily, but open. To make that opening real, she needed more than hope. She needed money, paperwork, language. Her French, learned in Poland, was good on the page but stiff on the tongue. In her first weeks, she went everywhere with a dictionary in her pocket, stumbling over sounds, repeating new phrases to herself as she walked down streets lined with cafes and shops. The city felt huge and indifferent, but every time she passed the Sorbonne and looked up at its heavy classical facade, she felt the same little jolt inside. I am here. I can try. When she finally enrolled, the university did not bend itself to meet her. Lecture halls were crowded, the benches hard, the professors demanding. Most of the faces around her were male. Some of the men were used to seeing a few women in class and barely looked her way. Others stared, surprised, as if a strange animal had wandered into their midst. Marie responded the only way she knew how. She ignored the stares and worked harder than everyone. She moved out of her sister's apartment into a tiny rented room nearer to the university so she could save time on travel and spend longer in the library. The room was barely more than a box. There was a bed, a small table, a chair, a stove that did not always work. In winter, frost formed a lace on the inside of the single window. Sometimes she woke to find the water in her washbowl turned to thin ice. She wrapped herself in all the clothes she had and studied anyway, her breath fogging the air over her books. Money was always tight. There were days when she ate almost nothing. A piece of bread, an apple, a cup of black coffee stretched across hours of work. Once she fainted in the middle of her room and had to be helped by neighbors who realized that the brilliant young foreign student upstairs was starving herself without meaning to. A doctor told her she needed more food. She smiled, promised to be careful, and went back to her books. There was so much to learn and so little time. In the lecture halls, however, hunger and cold fell away. Physics and mathematics opened before her like long, complex paths that somehow made sense to her feet. She studied mechanics, electricity, magnetism, the new, strange world of atoms and molecules. She sat in the front rows, listening so intently that everything else blurred out. She took notes fast and neat. At night, she copied them again, filling page after page with clear, careful handwriting. The more she learned, the more she realized how much still lay beyond what anyone knew. She did not come to Paris to be noticed. She came to understand. But excellence has a way of drawing attention, even when it does not ask for it. After 2 years of study, she took her physics degree examinations and finished first in her class. For a moment, the medal in her hand and the highest marks next to her name meant more than any flag or border. The girl who had once been shut out of Warsaw's official university had risen to the top of one of Europe's finest institutions. It was a victory, but not an end. She wanted more, another degree, this time in mathematics, and beyond that, research. To do that, she needed a topic and a place to work. A professor pointed her toward an area of inquiry that needed careful hands and a sharp mind, the magnetic properties of different kinds of steel. And he pointed her toward a man who might help her find a laboratory, a quiet, intense scientist named Pierre Curie. When Marie first met Pierre, he did not look like the image of a grand French professor. He was shy, a little awkward, with a beard that never seemed quite neat and clothes that did not pay much attention to current style. His mind, however, was focused and precise. He had already done important work on crystals and on tiny electrical effects. When they talked about science, he listened to her as an equal, which was still a rare gift. There was no surprise in his eyes at the quality of her questions, no patronizing praise, just interest. He arranged for her to use a rough, poorly equipped space that he and his brother had once used for their own experiments. It was more shed than laboratory, with a cracked roof, uneven floor, and a mix of leftover apparatus. On cold days, it was almost as icy as her room. On hot days, it trapped heat and smells. But to Marie, it was a kingdom. It was a place where she could move between table and apparatus, between idea and test, without having to hide her excitement. She completed her first research work there, measuring how magnetism behaved in different steels. It was careful, patient work, the kind of study that builds slowly, one measurement at a time. The results were solid and respected, and they did something else as well. They deepened the bond between her and Pierre. They saw in each other the same steady devotion to truth, the same willingness to ignore comfort and status in favor of understanding. Their partnership grew from shared curiosity into friendship, and from friendship into love. Pierre asked her to marry him. At first, she hesitated. Her heart was still tied to Poland, to the promise she had made to herself to one day return and work for her country's education. She wondered if a life in France, even with a partner like Pierre, would mean giving up that part of herself. But when she went back to Warsaw for a visit, she found that the old blocks still stood where they always had. The universities were still closed to women. The doors she dreamed of opening were still bolted. Letters from Pierre reached her there, full of warmth and quiet insistence. He wrote that he could not imagine a better life than one spent with her, side by side in the lab. Slowly she understood that sometimes devotion to a cause can take a different shape than the one you first imagined. She returned to Paris. They married in a simple ceremony, more like a promise between friends than a grand event. For their honeymoon, they did not choose a resort or a famous city. They went on a bicycle tour, pedaling through the French countryside in simple clothes, soaking up sun and wind, laughing as they explored villages and fields. It was, in its way, a picture of who they were. Two people who found joy in movement, in discovery, in each other's company, more than in show. After the wedding, she took his last name in French form and became Marie Curie. The name that would one day appear in textbooks around the world began to settle around her like a new coat. But beneath it, she was still the same determined girl from Warsaw, now with more tools and one steadfast partner at her side. While they were building this quiet life together, another scientist in Paris made a discovery that would change their path forever. Henri Becquerel, studying uranium salts, found that they emitted mysterious rays, something that could fog photographic plates even in the dark, something that seemed to come from the material itself without any extra energy added. He did not yet know what it meant. The effect was curious, puzzling, and a little unsettling. Marie read about Becquerel's findings and felt a spark. Here was something new, something unexplained. These rays were not like ordinary light. They were not like X-rays, which had only recently been discovered and were caused by special tubes and high voltages. The energy seemed to leak from uranium all by itself, quietly, steadily. She chose this mystery as the subject for her doctoral thesis. It was a bold choice. She would be stepping into territory where the path was unclear, where few tools existed, where even the basic ideas were still foggy. But that made it all the more irresistible. She began with careful measurements, using an instrument called an electrometer, designed in part by Pierre and his brother. She measured how well different uranium compounds could discharge an electric charge in the air. The effect was tiny but real. She worked slowly, repeating experiments many times to be sure of her results. She found that the strength of the rays depended only on how much uranium was present, not on what chemical form it took. This suggested that the effect came from the atoms themselves, not from how they were arranged. She turned her attention to other elements. Thorium, another heavy metal, showed a similar behavior. Certain minerals did too. And here came the first hint of something even stranger. Some ore samples were more active than the amount of uranium in them could explain. It was as if the stone were hiding something more powerful than uranium, something that nature had mixed in tiny amounts. To talk about this new property, she chose a word. It had to be simple and clear. She called it radioactivity. With that word, the rays that had seemed like a trick of nature in Becquerel's lab became part of a new field of study, a field that she was quietly, carefully founding from a small, worn-out shed in Paris. In those early days, radioactivity was not yet the glowing, frightening force people would later imagine. It was a set of numbers in her notebook, a needle moving on an instrument, a faint effect that only patient measurement could reveal. The very thing that made it dangerous, that it could pass through flesh, that it came from the deep heart of atoms, was exactly what made it so fascinating to her. Marie did not yet know how far this choice would take her. She did not know that chasing this invisible energy would lead her to isolate new elements, that those elements would burn her skin and quietly weaken her blood, that her notebooks would one day need to be kept in lead boxes to protect anyone who tried to read them. She only knew that when she set an oar under her instrument and watched the readings climb, she felt the same deep calm she had felt as a child, following a line of numbers to its end. In a city full of bright cafes and crowded boulevards, in a time when most women were expected to stay far from such questions, Marie Curie stood in a shabby laboratory, her hands red from cold, her eyes tired but clear, and listened to the faint, steady whisper of something new. The quiet girl from Warsaw had found her mystery, and in deciding to follow it, she took the first true step into the world that would make her name, even as it began, very gently, to undo her body from within. In the little shed that served as their laboratory, the air was never quite still. In winter, your breath would cloud in front of your face. In summer, heat from stoves and vats would thicken the room until it felt like you were breathing through cloth. Rain tapped on the patched roof. A draft slipped under the door. It was a place most people would have walked into once, frowned, and backed away from. But for Marie and Pierre, it was the center of the universe. On a rough table stood the instrument that had helped her find her mystery, the sensitive electrometer that could detect the faintest electric currents. Nearby were samples of minerals, small lumps of stone laid out like a child's collection. Uranium, thorium, and most of all, pitchblende, a heavy dark ore from the mines of Joachimsthal. The miners there sent it to factories to extract uranium, which was used for things like ceramics and glass. What was left over, a low-value residue, was something no one cared much about. To the Curies, it became gold. Marie had noticed that this waste from pitchblende gave readings far stronger than pure uranium ever did. It was as if the stone were hiding a secret, some ingredient more active than anything yet known. The numbers on her instruments begged for an explanation. She became convinced that inside the black dust were new elements, ones the world had never seen, releasing powerful rays in tiny, steady streams. Finding them would not be simple. In that residue, whatever was new existed in almost unimaginably small amounts. To pull it out, to hear its voice clearly, she and Pierre would have to handle not grams, but tons of material. They needed more pitchblende than any ordinary laboratory would ever see. They convinced the Austrian government to sell them what the factories threw away. Loads of heavy sacks arrived, filled with coarse, dull powder. It did not look like the future of physics. It looked like something you would sweep off a floor. They unloaded it themselves, shoulders straining, hands roughening around the coarse sacks. There were no assistants to spare them the labor, no fancy equipment to do the work automatically. They were the assistant and the scientist, all in one. Days turned into a slow dance of stirring, boiling, lifting, waiting. They worked with huge iron cauldrons set over open fires, stirring the thick, dark masses with iron rods as if they were cooking some heavy, reluctant soup. Out in the yard, huge tubs steamed in the cold air. Inside the shed, the tables were crowded with bottles and beakers, each holding solutions at different stages: dissolved, filtered, crystallized. Chemistry at that level is not just numbers and neat formulas on a page. It is smell and weight and heat. It is the ache of muscles at the end of a day. It is a patient conversation with matter, with minerals that do not want to give up their secrets easily. Marie tended this whole process like a gardener tending a strange new crop. She knew which liquid needed to be poured off, which residue had to be kept, which crystals hinted at something new. She kept meticulous notes in her notebooks, lines and lines of figures and observations written in a clear, calm hand. In those days, she did not wear gloves when she handled the substances. Few did. No one yet understood that the invisible rays they were chasing could, given enough time, chase them back. At first, the progress was slow and discouraging. Each step removed impurities, and each step still left the faint signal of something more active than uranium. "It is there," the number seemed to say, "but you have not reached me yet." She and Pierre worked through those long months almost like people digging toward a sound they hear far underground, each shovelful of earth bringing them a little closer to the source. At last, the faint signal became clearer. In one fraction, divided and purified again and again, she found an activity greater than before. The new substance behaved like bismuth in some ways, but its radioactivity was far stronger. She proposed that it was a new element and named it polonium after the Poland that still lived in her heart. It was a quiet, almost private act of defiance, to inscribe the name of her suppressed homeland into the periodic table. Polonium was only the first. The pitchblende continued to whisper that there was more. Another fraction, this one chemically similar to barium, glowed even brighter in her measurements. It resisted all attempts to be fully separated. Step after step, treatment after treatment, its activity increased. The rays it emitted were so intense that small samples could fog photographic plates nearby without any further help. The stone was growing more radiant as they stripped away its companions. The day they finally isolated enough of this new substance to see its character clearly must have felt almost unreal. What they found was a salt, radium chloride, almost impossibly active compared to uranium. It was as if a tiny coal of invisible fire had been uncovered, something that seemed to give off energy endlessly. When they measured how much it affected the air, the numbers leapt. This was not just another element, it was something extraordinary. They called it radium, from the Latin word for ray. The name fit. In a darkened room, radium compounds gave off a faint, eerie light, a soft blue-green glow that looked like a ghostly candle. When the day's work was done and they turned the lamps down, they could look toward the shelves and see vials standing there, quietly shining, as if someone had bottled pieces of moonlight. To Marie, exhausted and engrossed, it was a kind of magic that had nothing to do with spells and everything to do with patient work. She later wrote about how beautiful it was, those little tubes glimmering on a shelf or by her bedside. She would keep samples near her at night just to enjoy their glow, the way another person might be comforted by the flicker of a fireplace. It never occurred to her that their beauty had teeth. The rays from radium did not just pass through air and fog film, they passed through skin. After handling radioactive salts for long hours, Marie and Pierre both noticed that their fingers reddened and burned, as if they had been too long in the sun. At first, this fascinated them. Here was another demonstration of radium's power, another clue to how it behaved. They did not see it as a warning. How could they? No one had yet mapped out the long, slow path from those burns to deeper damage. As the news of their discoveries spread, the scientific world woke up. The idea that atoms were not solid, unchanging bits of matter, but could spontaneously emit energy, shook physics at its roots. Henri Becquerel, whose initial experiments with uranium had started this chain, shared in the excitement. Together, he, Marie, and Pierre were recognized as pioneers of a new field. In 1903, the Nobel Committee in Stockholm decided to award the prize in physics for this work on rays and radioactivity. At first, the committee plans to honor only Becquerel and Pierre. It was still easy for people to overlook the woman whose hands had done much of the measuring and stirring, whose notebooks contained the first careful use of the word radioactivity. But Pierre, hearing of this, spoke up. He made it clear that the work had been a partnership, that Marie's contributions were not secondary but central. Because he insisted, her name was added. They traveled to Sweden together to stand before a king in clothes borrowed and hastily made presentable and accept the prize. The ceremony was grand and formal. Marie, who preferred her shed in her numbers, endured the speeches and the shining hall with quiet patience. The honor mattered, of course. It meant recognition, money that could ease their constant financial strain, new opportunities for research. But afterwards, she returned as quickly as possible to the place where she felt most herself, the lab, the shed, the smell of chemicals, and the companionship of her instruments. With the Nobel funds, they could afford to improve their working conditions. A more suitable laboratory was planned, one that would eventually become the Radium Institute. They could buy better equipment, hire a few helpers, make the work slightly less physically brutal. Yet even with these improvements, Marie's habits did not soften much. She still wore simple clothes, still traveled on foot with her mind half on her surroundings and half on some problem in her head, still handled radioactive materials with a familiarity that seems shocking now. Outside their lab, the world fell in love with radium. Its glow captured imaginations. It was mixed into luminous paint for watches and clock dials so that their numbers could be read in the dark. Entrepreneurs added it to tonics and creams, promising health, energy, and youth in a bottle. Radium water, radium chocolate, even radium toothpaste appeared in advertisements, glowing with false promises. People believed that a substance so powerful and mysterious must be good for them, must bring some kind of vitality just by being close. Marie watched some of these developments with concern. She hated the idea of her research being turned into a cheap fad. She cared about understanding, about careful medical use, not about glowing labels in shop windows. But her protests could not fully dam the flood of enthusiasm. The age of radium had begun, and with it, both wonders and quiet tragedies. Back in the lab, the wonders and tragedies were mixing in her own blood. She often worked long hours without rest, so absorbed in her experiments that she forgot to eat properly or sleep enough. Fatigue settled into her bones like a slow, steady weight. Her fingertips were often sore, the skin damaged from handling radioactive salts and from the acids and alkalis as chemical separations. She treated these small injuries as ordinary, part of the price of serious work. The deeper injuries were invisible. Every day she spent near tubes of radium, near piles of radioactive residues, near instruments that measured the constant whisper of rays in the air. Her body was absorbing dose after tiny dose of ionizing radiation. Bone marrow, the quiet factory where blood cells are made, is sensitive to such things. but that knowledge lay decades in the future. For Marie, there was only the feeling that she tired more easily, that sometimes her joints ached, that she needed to push herself a little harder to do the same tasks. Even so, she did not slow down. There was always more to explore. She investigated how radium's rays affected living tissue, learning that they could kill diseased cells, a discovery that would one day help treat cancers. She refined measurements, determined atomic weights, mapped out the behavior of radioactive families of elements. Her days were full, divided between the demands of research, the needs of her family — she and Pierre now had 2 daughters — and the attention that fame had brought. Journalists came, wanting to photograph her in the lab, to ask how it felt to be a woman at the forefront of science. She answered politely, though she often found these questions tiresome. For her, the important part was not that she was a woman in science, but that science was being done well. Yet she knew that her very presence sent a message to other girls and women watching from the edges, the way she had once watched the closed doors of Warsaw's universities. In the evenings, after the reporters had gone and the instruments were quiet, she sometimes walked home alone through the Paris streets. The city's lights shone in windows and along avenues, but some of the brightest light she carried with her in small lead-lined containers in her pockets or bag, samples of radium, carefully stored, yet still full of their endless invisible fire. To her, they represented possibility, new knowledge, new medicine, new ways of understanding matter itself. She could not see that, in a different way, they also represented a slow unraveling of her own body. That is the strange, tender sadness of this part of her story, that the same glow that delighted her, that made her lab shelves shine softly in the dark, was quietly writing a different kind of story in her bones and blood. She had set out in that shabby shed to pull light out of stone. She succeeded. But as radium's blue ghost shone more brightly in the world, it also moved silently through her, leaving marks no one yet knew how to read. For now, though, in this chapter of her life, the balance still seems to tilt toward wonder. Marie Curie walks between home and lab, between family and formulas, between public honors and private calculations, carrying an invisible lantern that has only just begun to show its full power. The shadows it casts, the hints of danger, the signs of strain, are faint and easy to overlook. The real cost will come later, in blood tests and diagnoses with unfamiliar names. Tonight, though, the vials on her bedside table still look simply beautiful, softly glowing in the dark as she finally closes her eyes and rests. By the time the world began to slide toward war, Marie's life had already been split once by sudden loss. One rainy April day in 1906, Pierre left their home as he always did, papers in his pocket, thoughts already drifting toward experiments not yet done. The streets of Paris were slick with water, horses skittish on the stones. A heavy wagon passed, its wheels iron-rimmed and unforgiving. In the confusion of traffic and rain, Pierre slipped and fell beneath those wheels. There was no slow illness, no bedside farewell. One moment he was part of the world, and the next he was not. When news reached Marie, it must have felt at first like a mistake, some cruel confusion that could be cleared up if she just got to the right place quickly enough. But the facts did not move. Pierre was gone, and no amount of reason or courage could bring him back. The man who had walked beside her through years of poverty and discovery, who had insisted that her name be added to the Nobel Prize, who had shared long days in the shed and bright afternoons on bicycles, had been taken in a single, senseless instant. Grief fell over her like a heavy, dark coat. She had known loss before, her mother, her sister, but this was different. Pierre had not just been a husband, he had been a mirror for her mind. Someone who understood the way her thoughts moved, who cared as deeply as she did about the invisible patterns in nature. Without him, the lab felt wrong, airless. The instruments sat silent on their tables. The little vials of glowing radium, once so full of promise, looked to her like lonely stars in a sky that had gone suddenly cold. For a time, she stumbled through days that did not seem to belong to her. Friends worried. Even work could not immediately pull her out of that hollow. And yet, amid the condolences and the stunned silences, there was a decision to be made. Pierre had held a chair in physics at the Sorbonne. When he died, that chair was empty. The university could have given it to another man. That would have been the expected path. Instead, they offered it to Marie. To accept meant stepping into a place no woman had ever been before, a full professorship at one of Europe's great universities. It meant standing at the front of lecture halls where she had once sat, shy and cold, taking notes. It meant turning her private grief into a kind of public duty, carrying on the work they had started together. She said yes. On the day of her first lecture, the great hall was packed. Colleagues, students, curious strangers, even members of the press crowded the benches and aisles. Some came because they admired her. Others came because they wanted to see if a woman would falter in a place always held by men. She walked in quietly, without fuss. Her black dress was simple. Her notes were clear. She began not with a dramatic declaration, but with the same sentence Pierre had used in his last lecture, as if reaching out a hand across the gap that separated them. Then she went on, explaining complex ideas with the calm, precise clarity that had always been her strength. Slowly, life reformed around new shapes. She threw herself into her work at the Radium Institute, into raising her daughters, Irene and Eve, into continuing the research that had begun in the shed. Her name alone appeared on papers now. She traveled to conferences, met other scientists, argued and explained, always with that same quiet intensity. Her body, though, carried more scars than were visible. The years of exposure to radiation, the long hours, the strain of grief, they all left marks in places no one could see. And then, history's tide turned outward. In 1914, the spark that would become World War I caught and spread. Alliances snapped tight like ropes. Borders that had once been lines in textbooks became edges of trenches and battlefields. France found itself at war with Germany. Men marched away in uniforms, trains filled with young faces trying to be brave. The sound of distant artillery rumbled at the edges of cities. Hospitals began to fill with the wounded. Marie could have retreated into her lap away from the chaos. She was, by then, internationally famous. No one would have blamed her for continuing her work in relative safety. But for her, the point of understanding the world had never been only to know. It had always been, in some deep way, to help. When she heard about soldiers lying in tents and churches, doctors cutting into flesh without knowing exactly where bullets lay, she realized that the strange invisible rays she knew so well could become something else, a way to see inside the body without opening it completely. X-rays, discovered by Wilhelm Röntgen only a few years before her work on radium, were still a new and fragile technology. A few large hospitals and cities had machines, but the front lines, where surgeons worked hurriedly on one wounded man after another, had none. Amputations were often done almost blindly. Shrapnel remained hidden. Bones were set by guesswork. The idea came to her with the clean logic of a problem and its solution. Bring the X-rays to the wounded instead of waiting for the wounded to reach the machines. She set herself to work as if on a new experiment. First, she needed equipment, X-ray tubes, generators, vehicles to carry them. That meant money. She wrote letters, gave interviews, visited wealthy patrons and officials, explaining with patient urgency how these machines could save lives and limbs. Some were slow to understand, distracted by bigger strategies and front lines. Others saw at once what she was trying to do. Piece by piece, funds appeared. Not enough at first, then enough to begin. Next, she needed permission. The army was wary of civilians, especially women, entering its realm. But Marie was not easily discouraged. She met with generals, laid out diagrams, explained that she was not asking to play at medicine, but to equip doctors with better eyes. Her reputation helped. Even those who did not fully grasp the physics behind her words knew that she was not a woman given to foolish schemes. Eventually, they agreed. The first mobile radiological units were simple by later standards, but miraculous then. They were cars and small trucks, fitted with generators, X-ray tubes, photographic plates, and dark tents or curtained spaces to develop images. They came to be called Petite Curies, little Curies by the soldiers and staff, a nickname that made her smile faintly when she heard it. The name was light, but the work was anything but. She did not simply design them and send them off. She learned to drive, a rare skill for a woman at the time, so she could go to the front herself. In makeshift hospitals near the fighting, she rolled up her sleeves and stepped into rooms thick with the smell of blood, sweat, and antiseptic. She helped position limbs under the tubes, watched the ghostly outlines of bones appear on plates, pointed out where a fragment of metal lay lodged. Surgeons, at first skeptical of this strange new apparatus, soon saw that their work became surer, their cuts more precise, their patients' chances better. Protective gear was rudimentary or non-existent. She stood for hours near humming tubes and glowing screens, surrounded by fields of radiation she could not see but knew were there. When parts broke, she repaired them with her own hands, unafraid to handle equipment that sputtered and sparked. The light from the tubes painted pale patterns on walls and faces, a ghostly illumination in rooms otherwise lit only by lamps and hope. She knew she could not be everywhere at once, so she began to train others. Women who might once have been kept far from battlefields came forward to help. She taught them the basics of anatomy, electricity, and radiology in crash courses, turning volunteers into technicians and nurses capable of operating the machines. Her daughter, Irene, still a teenager, joined her, absorbing both the science and the sense of duty that drove her mother. Together, they supervised the setup of X-ray rooms and hospitals across France, both fixed and mobile. Traveling from site to site, Marie saw more of the war's scars than most civilians ever would. She saw rows of beds, each holding a young man whose life had been split into before and after by an explosion or a bullet. She saw doctors whose eyes were red from lack of sleep, whose hands shook as they lifted instruments. She saw nurses whose gentleness did not falter even when their own bodies were nearly spent. In this world of makeshift wards and constant urgency, her fame meant almost nothing. What mattered was whether the machine worked, whether the plate came out clear, whether the surgeon could see what he needed to see. She rarely spoke about the fear that must have brushed against her in those places. The sound of guns in the distance, the rumors of retreats and advances, the knowledge that any day the front might move closer. She simply worked. When she fell ill from exhaustion, she rested briefly, then returned. Her hair grew streaked with gray faster than it might have if her life had stayed within the cleaner boundaries of lecture halls and laboratories. Her skin, already marked by years of contact with radium, bore new quiet injuries from long exposure to X-ray beams. The war dragged on, year after year, grinding lives into statistics. By its end, more than 1 million soldiers had passed through X-ray units in France, many of them in little Curies she had designed. Countless limbs were saved that would otherwise have been lost. Countless operations were done with greater precision. Marie did not wear a uniform, but she had fought in her own way, using rays instead of rifles. When the armistice finally came in 1918, the world staggered with relief and grief mixed together. The guns fell silent. The fields of Europe were scarred with trenches and dotted with crosses. Men returned home changed. Some did not return at all. Marie stepped back from the battlefront hospitals and returned to Paris, to the Radium Institute she had founded not long before the war began. She could have let herself rest then. She had earned it 100 times over. But rest, for her, meant something different than for most people. It meant returning to the quieter, deeper questions that had always pulled at her. What exactly is happening inside radioactive atoms? How can their energy be harnessed carefully? How can the strange potentials of radium and its kin be used in medicine without causing harm, or at least with harm carefully weighed against benefit?
In the peaceful years that followed, her work shifted more toward building structures that would outlast her: laboratories, institutes, training programs. The Radium Institute in Paris became a center for research on radioactivity and its applications. Young scientists from many countries came to work there, drawn by the chance to learn from her. She walked its corridors in her plain dresses, greeting them with the same mixture of reserve and sincerity that had always marked her interactions. Her body, however, was beginning to tell its own story more loudly. She tired more easily. Simple infections left her more drained than they once had. Her hands were often painful, her eyesight sometimes blurred. At the time, doctors could not point directly to radiation sickness as we understand it now. They spoke instead of anemia, of weakness, of the wear and tear of a life lived intensely. But somewhere deep inside her, bone marrow that had been quietly damaged for years was failing, slowly, cell by cell. She never complained much. When people asked about her health, she would shrug, make a small joke, turn the conversation back to work. She still took trains to give lectures, still traveled to raise funds for science, still stood in laboratories late into the evening, adjusting instruments with hands that had carried radioactive vials and operated X-ray machines through war and peace. If she felt the cost, she carried it like another heavy sack of pitchblende, simply something that had to be borne to reach the goal. Sometimes at night, she must have thought back to that girl in Warsaw, listening at doors for forbidden lessons, staring at maps of a Poland she could not freely claim. She had chosen, long ago, to pour herself into the search for knowledge. The world had given her honors, positions, and influence in return, but it had not spared her body. Perhaps, in quiet moments, she weighed the ledger: the limbs saved during the war, the cancers that doctors were now beginning to treat with radium, the young scientists she was training, her own fatigue, her persistent illnesses. The balance was not simple. It never is. The sky over Paris at night looks to her much as it did when she first arrived: a scatter of stars above dark roofs, a chill in the air, the hum of a great city living and struggling and dreaming. She walks home from her institute with a slower step now, but the same inward focus, already thinking about the next experiment, the next lecture, the next young mind who might push further than even she has gone. Her hands are tired, her blood is thinner, but the light she has pulled from stone is still burning, in hospital rooms, in laboratories, in the imaginations of students who have grown up in a world where words like radium and radioactivity are no longer mysteries, but starting points. Soon, the final chapter of her life will begin, in hospital rooms of her own, in diagnoses that give a name to the failing of her marrow. But for tonight, you can picture her leaving the war behind, stepping once more into the quieter battlefield of equations and instruments, still doing what she has always done, moving patiently toward understanding, even as the very act of moving takes more from her than anyone around her can truly see. In her later years, Marie Curie's face grew more lined, her hair more silver, but the way she leaned over a notebook did not change. She still bent close to the page, pen held firmly, numbers marching in neat columns. The Radium Institute in Paris, which she had helped build from an idea into bricks and laboratories, buzzed quietly around her. Young scientists moved through its halls, carrying on experiments she had helped design, following lines of thought that began in her little shed years before. She was no longer alone at the front of a new field. She was its center of gravity, drawing minds from around the world. On some mornings, she walked slowly from her modest apartment to the institute, a small figure in dark clothes moving through the busy Paris streets. To strangers, she might have looked like any older woman on an errand. Only those who recognized her would turn and whisper, "That is Madame Curie." Even then, she did not invite special treatment. She took the tram, stood in line, waited her turn. Fame sat on her shoulders lightly. What weighed more heavily was the work still to be done. Inside the institute, she divided her time between research and teaching. She oversaw projects on the chemistry of radioactive elements, on their use in medicine, on the behavior of their rays. She guided younger scientists with a firm but gentle hand.
When they brought her results that excited them, she listened patiently, asked precise questions, pointed out where the data was strong and where it needed more support. She did not raise her voice or seek to impress. Her authority came from the depth of her understanding and the consistency of her character. Her older daughter, Elaine, had followed her into science. Together, they could often be found standing by an apparatus, mother and daughter in white lab coats, discussing measurements, deciding on the next step. There was something quietly beautiful in that image. Knowledge passed not only through lectures and books, but from one pair of working hands to another. Elaine would go on to win a Nobel Prize herself one day. Marie could not see all of that yet, but she could see enough to know that the light she had helped kindle would not go out when she did. Her younger daughter, Eve, chose a different path, one of music and writing. Through Eve's eyes, we see Marie at home, reading late into the night, mending clothes, carrying food to the lab rather than stopping to eat properly, laughing rarely but warmly when something truly delighted her. Eve wrote of her mother's worn coat, her old hat, her refusal to waste money on luxuries when there were always more instruments to buy, more students to help. Marie's greatness lived not only in grand discoveries, but in these small refusals to turn away from simplicity. Outside the laboratory, the world shifted again. New discoveries built on hers. Other scientists explored the nucleus of the atom, dug deeper into the structure of matter. Radioactivity, once a puzzling curiosity, became a window into the heart of things. There were revelations both hopeful and troubling. People began to see that the energy locked inside atoms was far greater than anyone had imagined. Some dreamed of endless power. Others, more darkly, imagined new weapons. These thoughts were still forming at the edges of her lifetime, like distant storms on a horizon she could only just glimpse. Meanwhile, radium itself moved into hospitals. Doctors placed small, sealed tubes of it near tumors, using its rays to damage cancer cells. The treatments were crude by modern standards, the doses not always well measured, but they opened a new path, radiotherapy. When Marie visited clinics, she saw patients whose lives had been extended, whose pain had been eased by the very substance she had pulled from ore with such effort. It must have given her a quiet, deep satisfaction to see this. Science, for her, was never only about ideas. It was about what those ideas could do for real bodies in real pain. Her own body, though, was showing more clearly the cost of her lifelong closeness to radioactive materials. She suffered frequent fatigue. There were days when climbing stairs left her breathless. Her eyesight weakened. Strong light bothered her increasingly. Sometimes she struggled with dizziness and weakness that did not pass with rest. Physicians examined her and spoke of anemia, of a blood disorder, of bone marrow that was not producing enough healthy cells. They did not need to say aloud what she already suspected, that the years spent among radium and X-rays had quietly carved out her strength. Even then, she did not dramatize her suffering. When she wrote to friends or colleagues, she mentioned her health only in passing, as an inconvenience that slowed her work. She continued to travel when invited, though more slowly, more carefully. There is a photograph of her taken in America, where she traveled to receive a gram of radium donated by American women who had raised funds in her honor. In the picture, she looks serious, almost shy, holding a small lead-lined box that contains the precious element. The journey itself tired her deeply, but she understood its importance. That gift would feed the Institute's research for years. As the 1930s began, Europe felt restless again. Economic hardship and political tensions stirred uneasily. Marie's attention, however, stayed mostly on her institute, on her students, on the quiet, slow work of understanding. She spent more time at a desk than at a bench now, her body less willing to endure the long hours of physical labor she had once put into stirring vats of pitchblende. But her mind remained sharp. She reviewed papers, wrote articles, planned lectures, thought about the future of the science she had helped midwife into the world. Then, in the spring of 1934, her health took a sharper turn. She developed a persistent fever and a crushing exhaustion that did not yield to rest. Doctors examined her and diagnosed aplastic anemia, a failure of the bone marrow, the factory of blood. It is a condition that can appear suddenly, but is often the result of long-term damage. In her case, we now understand, it was the slow culmination of decades spent soaked in the invisible rain of radiation. She was taken to a sanatorium in the French countryside, high in the mountains, where the air was clear and cool. The plan was simple: rest, care, the hope that her body might recover some of its strength. The building was quiet, with long white corridors and windows that looked out onto trees and sky. For the first time in many years, her days were not divided by lectures or experiments, but by meals and visits from doctors and family. It is strange to imagine Marie Curie confined to a bed, far from her instruments. She had always been so active, so purposeful. Even in grief and hardship she had moved. Now, movement itself exhausted her. She read when she could, but her eyes tired quickly. She spoke with Irene and Ev when they visited, listened to their updates about the Institute, about the world outside, about the small details of daily life that tie us to each other. But the thread of her life was drawing thinner. On July 4, 1934, Marie Curie died quietly at the age of 66. There were no dramatic last words, no staged scene, just a body that had worked very hard for a very long time, finally letting go. The doctors wrote their reports. Newspapers around the world published obituaries, praising her courage, her brilliance, her role as a pioneer. Scientists mourned a colleague and leader. Her daughters mourned their mother. For a moment, the world paused to notice the passing of the woman who had pulled new kinds of light out of stone. Even in death, the story of her body and radiation was not over. The notebooks she had filled, the lab equipment she had used, even some of the furniture from her workspaces were so contaminated by radioactivity that they would remain dangerous for generations. Today, if you go to see her papers in certain archives, you are given special protective clothing and gloves. The ink has not faded, but what surrounds it has become a kind of invisible hazard, a long echo of all those hours she spent among radium salts and unshielded tubes.
Her remains were first buried in a small cemetery alongside Pierre's. Later, in 1995, she and Pierre were moved to the Pantheon in Paris, a grand tomb for national heroes. Their coffins were sealed in lead to prevent the radiation from their bones from affecting visitors. Even in that solemn resting place, the same invisible rays that had defined their lives continued to whisper through the dark. It is a detail almost too symbolic. The woman who revealed radioactivity lying forever in a shielded casket, her body and her work still bound together. But if we step back from the quiet drama of glowing notebooks and lead-lined coffins, we can see something gentler. Marie Curie did not set out to destroy her body. She did not seek martyrdom. She simply refused to turn away from the questions that called to her, even when the tools to explore them were still rough, even when the risks were unknown. She accepted hardship as the price of understanding, and when she learned that the forces she studied could heal as well as harm, she devoted herself to that healing work without hesitation. The light she helped uncover has been used in many ways. Some are dark, weapons that split atoms apart to release terrible power. Some are bright, machines that let doctors see inside bodies without cutting, treatments that shrink tumors, scanners that trace the flow of blood through beating hearts. The responsibility for these uses does not rest on her shoulders alone, but she stands near the beginning of this path, a figure with burned fingertips and tired eyes, stirring heavy vats and watching needles twitch on delicate instruments. In the soft light of a bedtime story, we can imagine her not in a lab, not in a hospital, but in a quieter place. Perhaps she is standing in a field at dusk, the sky above her fading from blue to deep indigo. Stars begin to appear, tiny points of light built from nuclear fires too distant to see clearly. She tilts her head back and looks at them, knowing more than most about the secret processes burning within those stars and within the atoms in her own body. She knows that in some deep way, everything is made of the same stuff, that the rays she measured in her shed are cousins to the light that has traveled from those stars to her eyes. The girl from Warsaw who listened at doors, the student who shivered in a freezing room in Paris, the young wife stirring cauldrons of pitchblende, the grieving widow who took her husband's place at the Sorbonne.
the scientist in wartime hospitals, the aging professor at the Radium Institute, the patient in the mountain sanatorium. They are all the same person, carried through time by a single steady flame of curiosity and determination.
As you lie here, letting your own breath slow, you can choose what to hold on to from her story. Maybe it is the image of little vials glowing softly on a nightstand, beautiful and dangerous at once. Maybe it is the thought of the petite Curies rattling toward the front lines, bringing invisible eyes to wounded soldiers. Maybe it is simply the quiet knowledge that one person, starting with nothing but a sharp mind and a stubborn heart, can change how the whole world sees matter and energy, even if that change writes itself into her bones. You do not have to rush to judgment about her choices. You do not have to decide whether the price she paid was worth it. You can just let her life settle in your thoughts like a stone on the bottom of a still pool, its edges softened by water and time. Above that stone, the surface of the pool is smooth. Stars reflect on it. Your own face might too if you leaned over it. Tonight, Marie Curie's laboratories are quiet. Her notebooks rest in their boxes. Hospitals hum with machines that owe part of their existence to her work. Somewhere, a student is scribbling equations late into the night, not yet knowing where they will lead. The world she helped shape goes on, full of light and shadow, danger and hope. You can close your eyes now and let her walk back into history, into her lab, into the pages of books. The invisible rays she studied are still moving all around us, through stone and air and flesh, mostly harmless, sometimes helpful, sometimes frightening. But for this moment, they are just part of the background hum of the universe, like a distant river you hear from your window as you drift toward sleep. She has done her work. You have heard her story. The rest of the night belongs to your own quiet thoughts, to the slow, healing darkness that asks nothing from you except that you rest.